I found hidden cameras in my bedroom while everyone told me I was being paranoid. Hi there, welcome to Story Nest. Don't forget to subscribe. It's a small click that makes a huge difference. I never thought I'd be the one dealing with something like this. I'm an English teacher at a local high school, and as a woman, I've grown used to the awkwardness that can sometimes come with the job. Teenage boys, bless them, tend to behave a little differently around me. It's nothing new. A few teasing comments here and there, like, "Miss, you're pretty," or "Miss, would you be so-and-so's Valentine?" Most of the time, it's harmless, good-natured fun. But when it's something more, you feel it. This year, I was asked to chaperone the annual senior ball, an event where they celebrate the new year, though it's mostly an excuse to dress up and act like they're grown-ups. The event was alcohol-free, of course, but I knew some of the students had likely snuck in drinks. It wasn't unusual for that to happen. I was keeping an eye on the room when I noticed two students sitting off to the side, clearly avoiding the crowd. They were a couple of my problem students, kids who never quite fit in with the others, always sitting alone or hanging back. Their appearance was usually messy, greasy hair, long fingernails, and a general disheveled look. You know the type. I'd seen them around for a while, and despite their social struggles, they always seemed to find a way to make themselves known. Academically, they didn't do well, either. But that night, as I approached them, something felt off. They weren't just sitting quietly like usual. There was a smell in the air. And the way they were speaking slow, almost slurred, told me they had been drinking. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm, "I need to see what you've got in your pockets." No alcohol allowed. One of the boys, Stuart, was the first to speak. I'd known him long enough to expect something sarcastic. But what he said, that stopped me cold. "Come on, miss," he slurred, looking up at me with a mischievous grin. "Don't pretend you won't open that bottle of Bailey's when you get home, feet up in your dressing gown, watching the new TV. Give us a break." I stood frozen, my heart dropping into my stomach. I was sure he didn't know those things. He couldn't. How could he? Stuart's words hit me like a slap in the face. My first thought was disbelief. There was no way he could know any of that. I just bought that bottle of Bailey's the weekend before. And the dressing gown bit? That's something I only ever wear on the rare evenings when I'm home alone, enjoying a quiet night in. It's the ultimate indulgence, bath, a cozy robe, and a movie. But most of all, I kept thinking about the new TV he mentioned. My husband and I had just replaced our old one over Christmas. No one at school had any reason to know about it. Or so I thought. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. I demanded that Stuart hand over any alcohol he was hiding, my voice barely steady. He just laughed it off, shrugging as if nothing was wrong. "Lucky guess," he said, his eyes glinting with something that felt off, like he was enjoying this. But it wasn't a guess. No way. I left them standing there at the table, my heart racing in my chest. I barely made it through the rest of the night. The ball carried on around me, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. My mind spun with questions. How had he known about the Baileys, the dressing gown, the new TV? I was certain I'd never mentioned any of that to anyone, let alone a student. Was I losing my mind? Had I said something offhand in class without realizing? No, I couldn't have. But then, how else could he have known? The more I thought about it, the worse it got. When I finally got home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of someone watching me. It was ridiculous. I had a small house, no big surprises there. But still, I checked every door and window before I locked up. The sounds of my own footsteps seemed louder than usual, like someone was just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I tried to call my husband, but he was out of town for work. The conversation was brief. He didn't understand why I was so shaken up. "You're overthinking it," he said, dismissing my concerns like they were nothing. He probably overheard you talking about it or saw something online. Kids guess weird stuff all the time. But that didn't sit right with me. There was no way he could have just guessed it. This wasn't some random observation. My gut told me something was wrong, something I couldn't quite explain. I felt like I was losing control of my own reality. The paranoid didn't let up. The next day, every creak in the floorboards made me jump. Every car that slowed down outside made my heart race. I would find myself staring out the window, watching for anything suspicious, my mind spiraling into darker thoughts. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the sense that my privacy, my personal life, had been violated in a way I couldn't quite comprehend. The next few days were a blur of unease. I couldn't focus in class. I found myself constantly glancing at Stuart, trying to read something in his expression that would tell me how he knew those things. But nothing stood out. He was the same as ever. Quiet, distracted, never finishing his homework. His behavior hadn't changed, but I couldn't stop thinking about his words. They played on a loop in my mind. Dressing gown, Bailey's, new TV. The more I tried to ignore it, the more those phrases echoed, each repetition making my stomach twist in a new, sharper knot. I wanted answers. I needed them. But where could I even start? The thought that someone close, was spying on me felt like a distant nightmare, but as the days passed, it didn't seem so impossible anymore. The logical part of my brain told me to take a step back. Maybe Stuart had overheard something. Maybe he had seen my husband's new TV in the living room when he had come to drop something off at school. But it didn't feel right. There was a dissonance there that I couldn't shake. It was as if there were pieces missing from a puzzle, but I was too scared to admit that I might be seeing things that weren't there. I brought it up again with my supervisor at school. I thought maybe she could offer some perspective, maybe help me calm down. But as soon as I explained what had happened, her response was predictable. "It's probably nothing," she said, waving it off as if it were an easily solvable problem. "Maybe you've said something without realizing it. You talk to your students all the time, right?" She made a gesture with her hands, like it was no big deal, a casual dismissal of my concerns. And that's when I felt it, the shift. The growing suspicion that no one was taking me seriously. I couldn't shake the feeling that Stuart wasn't just a kid with a lucky guess. It wasn't just some harmless remark. It was an invasion of privacy, a direct connection to my personal life in a way that seemed almost deliberate. But how could anyone know those details unless they'd been watching me? The realization made my skin crawl. I'd been so careful. I kept my private life separate from my work life. I wasn't some reckless teacher who overshared with her students. I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing through every conversation, every detail, every tiny interaction that might have given away more than I thought. I had to figure this out. If I didn't, I'd lose my mind trying to put the pieces together. The next day, I took a step I never thought I would have to take. I decided to search my house. Every inch of it. I spent hours scouring every room, checking behind furniture, under cushions, even in the attic. But I found nothing. Nothing that would explain the feeling of being watched. Nothing that would explain how Stuart had known about my new TV, my Bailey's, my robe. The paranoia was suffocating, though. What if I had missed something? What if it was right there in front of me? As I searched, I started to feel like I was slipping further into a world where nothing was what it seemed. Was this all just in my head? Or had someone really been spying on me? It was like I was living in some surreal nightmare. Each creak of the floor, each flicker of the lights, made me feel as though I was being followed. Watched. I couldn't take it anymore. My sense of privacy had been shattered, and I had no idea how to piece it back together. By the time I completed my search of the house, I was both exhausted and on edge. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I checked every closet, peered under every bed, and even went so far as to take apart the smoke detector in the hallway, just in case. It was absurd. The thought that someone might have planted a device to spy on me seemed like something out of a thriller, not my real life. But the feeling didn't go away. Then it happened. A few days later, after another sleepless night, I was sitting in my living room when my eyes caught something. A slight shadow in the corner of the room, near the wall. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit the corner. But as I stood up and moved closer, my heart dropped. There, tucked just behind the trim of the wall, was a small, nearly invisible device. It looked like a camera, Maybe a hidden security camera or something else entirely, but it was small, inconspicuous. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I moved quickly, my hands shaking, as I turned the living room upside down. There were other things hidden too. A second device. This one wasn't a camera, it seemed more like a listening device, though I wasn't sure. It was cleverly concealed inside an old light fixture, tucked away where no one would think to look. I felt sick to my stomach. How had this happened? Why hadn't I noticed before? The worst part? These devices had been there for months, maybe longer. I couldn't say for certain, but as I looked at the smoke detector in my bedroom, it looked different too. Slightly altered, like it had been swapped out for something else entirely. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been watching me, maybe for weeks, maybe longer. The sensation of being watched, that sense of unease I couldn't shake, had been real. I was shaking now, physically drained from the realization that my worst fears had come true. Someone had invaded my privacy in a way that left me feeling exposed, violated. I had no idea who was responsible. Could it have been Stuart? Or was it someone else? My stomach churned at the thought that the person who had done this might still be out there, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The discovery of the devices sent me spiraling. I couldn't simply ignore it anymore. This was real. I had to face it head on, even if I wasn't sure where to start. I immediately contacted the police. It felt surreal, dialing the number, explaining the situation, telling them I thought I had hidden cameras in my own home. It took a while for them to understand just how serious this was to me. The officer I spoke to was skeptical at first, but after I described the devices in more detail, he agreed to send someone over. The waiting was the worst part. I had no idea how deep this went. How far had this invasion of my privacy stretched? Could it be just one student? Or was there something else behind it? I couldn't get Stuart's words out of my head. How had he known? How could he have possibly guessed those things? I wasn't crazy. I knew I wasn't imagining this. But then, the logical part of me tried to make sense of it. Could I have said something in passing without realizing it? But no, it didn't add up. I hadn't told anyone about the TV. I hadn't mentioned the Baileys. Not even to my closest friends or family. When I told my husband what I'd found, he was just as shocked as I was. But his reaction was a little different. Instead of immediately offering comfort or suggestions, he seemed distant. He hadn't taken my concerns seriously at first, dismissing it as an overreaction. Now, he was apologetic. He'd been away on business when all of this started, and it had taken a toll on both of us. But his apology didn't bring me any peace. It only made me feel more isolated. What had I missed? How had I not seen the signs earlier? My husband promised to come home early, but I wasn't sure I was ready to see him yet. I had asked for some time apart, not because I blamed him, but because I didn't know who I could trust. The realization that someone had been watching me without my knowledge was like a thick fog, smothering every sense of security I had. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't live in the same house, knowing there were still things hidden from me. By the time the police arrived to investigate, I had already felt like I'd lived through 1,000 sleepless nights. Every noise, every shift of the wind outside, made me tense up. Even when I wasn't at home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was suffocating. I couldn't live like that anymore. Something needed to be done. The officers arrived quickly after my call, and I guided them through the house, showing them the spots where I had found the hidden devices. They seemed as stunned as I was, especially when they saw how well concealed they were. The one in the smoke detector, whoever had placed it there had done so with precision. It made me sick to think that someone had been able to hide something so invasive in plain sight for so long. The device in the light fixture, too, was small enough to be overlooked, blending in with the room's decor. The officers took the devices for further investigation. They told me it would take some time to identify where they had come from, but they promised to follow up with me once they had more information. But even as they assured me that everything would be handled, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whoever had been spying on me had been doing it for a reason. I just didn't know what that reason was yet. My mind wandered back to Stuart. Had he been the one to plant the devices? It felt like too much of a coincidence, but I had no proof. For all I knew, it could have been someone else entirely. The thought that my students were involved, that one of them could be responsible for this invasion, left me feeling more betrayed than I could put into words. I confided in my supervisor, hoping that someone at school would take me seriously, but again, her reaction was disappointing. She seemed to think it was an overreaction, just a paranoid teacher blowing things out of proportion. It felt like no one was truly listening to me, no one but the people online who had reached out with empathy and advice. They were the ones who helped me make sense of it all, who didn't dismiss my fears as irrational. The support from strangers online had made a big difference. I wouldn't have been brave enough to search my house so thoroughly if it hadn't been for their suggestions. People offered ideas like using a phone camera to check for hidden devices in the dark, and so I followed their advice, looking for any telltale glint of a lens or strange wires. I was meticulous. I knew I had to be. It was my privacy, my peace of mind on the line. But it wasn't enough. As much as I wanted answers, as much as I hoped the police would uncover the truth, I knew there was a long road ahead. The devices had already been found, but the real questions, who planted them, and why, remained unanswered. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, police reports, and an endless loop of questions running through my mind. Each moment felt like it stretched on forever. How had I missed it? How had I not noticed that something was off for so long? The police kept in touch, promising updates when they could, but the investigation moved at a glacial pace. In the meantime, my paranoia grew deeper. I found myself double-checking the locks on every door, watching the street outside my window with increasing suspicion, and avoiding quiet corners of my house that suddenly felt too still, too watchful. One evening, I came home to a strange car parked across the street. It was the third time that week I had seen it, but this time, my stomach clenched in a way I couldn't ignore. The first time it happened, I brushed it off as nothing. The second time, I made a mental note of it. But now, seeing the same car yet again, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I turned off all the lights, ducked behind the curtains, and waited, watching the car in the dimming light. Nothing happened. The car didn't move. But I couldn't relax. Could it be someone connected to the whole thing? Someone keeping an eye on me? Maybe they were waiting for me to make a mistake. It didn't help that my husband's return home didn't bring me any peace either. He was apologetic, yes, but also confused. He'd been away on business during most of this ordeal, and while he was now back, I felt more isolated than ever. He'd listened to my concerns before, but I could sense his doubts. He thought I might be overreacting. Maybe it was just a student playing a prank. But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt real. The more I tried to explain how deep my fear ran, the more he seemed worried about me, as if I were losing grip on reality. I decided to take action on my own, to stop waiting for someone else to solve this. I had already contacted the police, and I was doing everything I could to stay vigilant, but what else could I do? The sense of powerlessness was suffocating. I had to face this head-on, but how? How could I uncover the truth? I had a plan. The more I thought about Stuart, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be involved. How could he have known about the details of my personal life? The way he spoke, the look in his eyes, it didn't feel like a casual remark anymore. It felt deliberate. But what if I was wrong? What if I was just grasping at straws, letting my paranoia cloud my judgment? It seemed unlikely, but there were so many pieces of this puzzle that didn't fit, and Stuart was one of the few connections that kept standing out. I decided I had to confront him. Not directly, of course. I wasn't ready to accuse him of anything, not without concrete proof. But I had to get to the bottom of this. I had to find out if he was somehow involved in what had been happening. I arranged for a private conversation with him under the guise of helping him catch up on his work. Stuart had been a student of mine for a while, and though he was often distracted and unmotivated in class, I knew him well enough to know that he wasn't incapable of completing his assignments. Maybe, just maybe, he'd let something slip. The meeting was set for after school. I was a bundle of nerves, but I pushed through it, telling myself I could handle whatever came my way. I couldn't afford to let fear dictate my actions anymore. If I wanted answers, I had to stay in control. The day of the meeting with Stuart, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, doubts, and questions. Was I doing the right thing? What if I was wrong about him? The rational part of my brain told me I should just let the police handle it, but deep down, I felt like I needed to take control of the situation. I needed to look him in the eye and see if I could get some answers. I needed to hear him say something that could either confirm or dispel my suspicions. After the final bell rang, I waited in my classroom, silently running through what I would say. Stuart was a quiet student, often withdrawn, but he could be sharp when he wanted to be. I knew I had to be careful. I wasn't trying to accuse him outright, at least. Not yet, but I needed to see if he knew more than he was letting on. When he walked into the room, there was that usual shuffle to his step, that slouch of a kid who didn't quite fit in. I offered him a polite smile and gestured for him to sit. "Hey Stuart, thanks for coming. I wanted to talk to you about a few things." He nodded but didn't make eye contact. I could tell he was nervous, but not in a way that suggested he had done something wrong. He was just uncomfortable, like he always was when forced to interact. I pushed aside my anxiety and kept my tone casual. I wasn't here to make him feel cornered, I just needed to know more. "I've noticed you've been a bit distracted in class lately," I started, leaning forward just a little. "Everything okay?" He fidgeted with the sleeve of his hoodie, a typical sign of his discomfort. "Yeah, just stuff, you know?" I waited, watching him carefully. This was it. If I pushed too hard, he might shut down, but I needed to know if he was somehow involved in what had been happening to me. "Listen," I said, lowering my voice, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I'm not mad or upset, but I need you to tell me if you know anything about my personal life. About things like what I do at home, or my husband's new TV, or..." I trailed off, not sure how to phrase the rest without sounding completely paranoid. But Stuart didn't need me to finish the sentence. His eyes flickered up to meet mine, and I saw something there, a flash of recognition. It was subtle, but it was there. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, his voice a little too high-pitched. I could tell he was lying, but his response wasn't enough to confirm anything outright. I pressed on, not wanting to let him off the hook. "Stuart, I know you've been to my house. I know you've seen things you shouldn't have. So I'm asking you, how did you know about the Baileys, about the TV, about the dressing gown?" His jaw clenched. For a second, he didn't respond, and the silence between us felt heavier with each passing moment. Finally, he let out a sigh, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "Look," he muttered, I didn't mean to say anything. I was just messing around, okay? I didn't think it would freak you out like this." "Stuart," I said softly, leaning forward, "how did you know those things? You didn't just guess them, did you?" He hesitated, and for a long moment, I thought he might stay silent. But then, his voice dropped to a whisper, and he looked me in the eye. "I overheard you talking about it, okay? I wasn't spying or anything. I swear. But I heard you mention the Baileys one time, and your new TV. And the dressing gown. I don't know," it slipped out. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't what I expected at all. He wasn't the one who had planted the devices, but the fact that he had heard me talking about those personal details made the whole situation even more unsettling. It confirmed that my privacy was being invaded in ways I hadn't even realized. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Stuart, I don't think you understand how serious this is. It's not just about overhearing a conversation. It's about someone going to great lengths to invade my privacy, to make me feel unsafe in my own home." He seemed to shrink in on himself at that, his eyes avoiding mine again. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," he muttered, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry. I didn't know how to respond." His apology seemed empty, like he didn't fully grasp the magnitude of the situation. I stood up, my hands trembling as I ran them through my hair. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Stuart. But if you know anything about what's been going on, anything at all, You need to tell me. This is serious." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know anything about any devices, I swear." "I'm sorry." I looked at him one last time, searching for something in his eyes, some glimmer of truth. But all I saw was guilt. I couldn't tell if he was hiding something, or if he truly knew nothing more. All I knew was that my search for answers was far from over. I left the meeting with Stuart feeling more confused than ever. His story didn't add up. There was something off about the way he spoke, the way he looked away every time I asked him a direct question. But still, I had no concrete evidence. He could have been telling the truth, or he could have been hiding something. I couldn't be sure. The next few days passed in a haze of tension. The police hadn't given me any more information, and I had no choice but to wait for their findings. My paranoia continued to creep in, even in the daytime. I couldn't help but feel like someone was always just outside my line of sight, watching me, waiting. It was exhausting. But then, everything changed. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from the police. They had traced the devices back to their origin, and, to my shock, it wasn't Stuart at all. It wasn't anyone from my school. The devices had been bought through an online seller who specialized in hidden surveillance equipment. But the name that came up as the purchaser left me stunned. It was someone I knew intimately. It was my husband. The world seemed to spin on its axis, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The person I had trusted more than anyone, the one person I believed would always protect me, had been the one who violated my privacy in the worst possible way. He had been the one spying on me, watching me when I thought I was alone. When I confronted him, the truth came tumbling out. My husband had grown suspicious of me after I started pulling away. He had noticed my increased unease, the way I'd started acting distant, and he convinced himself that I was hiding someone. He'd installed the devices, thinking he could catch me in the act, thinking he could expose some imagined affair or betrayal. He was convinced that I was somehow cheating on him. He broke down as I stood there, tears in his eyes, begging me to understand. "I was just trying to know the truth," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought if I could just see what you were really doing when I wasn't around, I could figure out what was wrong." I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. How could he have done this? How could he have betrayed my trust in such a vile, cruel way? My anger boiled over, but beneath it, there was a deep, gnawing sadness. The man I had married, the man I thought I knew, was a stranger. I told him I couldn't stay. Not in that house, not with him. I couldn't be around someone who would do this to me, someone who thought violating my privacy was the answer to his insecurities. It was over. I packed a few things and left that day, staying with my parents for the time being. The next weeks were a blur. I sought therapy to process everything that had happened and the legal steps to ensure I was protected from my husband's invasion of privacy. The police had his devices, and he would face the consequences of his actions. But no matter what happened from there, nothing could undo the damage he had done to our marriage. As for Stuart, I never saw him again after that day. I don't know if he was ever involved in the spying, but I knew one thing for sure. The boundaries I had set in my life had been shattered. It was time to rebuild. I've since moved into a new place, one where I feel safe and secure, and I've slowly started to reclaim my sense of peace. The road ahead is still uncertain, and I'll never forget how deeply my privacy was violated. But I've learned the hard way that sometimes the monsters we fear the most are the ones closest to us. That's it for today's story. Subscribe and hit the like button if you want to hear more. It helps us out a lot.